Hey everybody, and welcome to the Bitcoin Blueprint podcast. My name is Stephan, and I will be your host. Now, if you stumbled upon this podcast, it is my hope that you are curious about Bitcoin and ready to learn more about how it works and what it is. And that's exactly the goal of this podcast. In this podcast, my goal is to demystify the intricacies of the first and most iconic cryptocurrency, which is Bitcoin. From its enigmatic origins with Satoshi Nakamoto to the mechanics of blockchain technology, from mining processes to its economic implications, I break down everything you've ever wanted to know and more. Whether you're a curious newbie or a seasoned enthusiast looking for a refresher, this series provides a comprehensive overview, ensuring you're well equipped in any conversation about Bitcoin. Now join us as we journey through the digital tunnels of this revolutionary currency, one block at a time. In this first and introductory episode of the podcast, we start from the beginning and we talk about what Bitcoin is. That means first also looking at what problems does Bitcoin solve, how was it founded, and who Satoshi Nakamoto is. So I hope you enjoy, and let's get started. Alrighty, well, let's dive into this first episode, which covers what Bitcoin is, and an introduction to what it is and what it means for society. And at its core, Bitcoin is one of the most transformative technological innovations of the 21st century and represents a true paradigm shift in the realm of finance and beyond. Now, the past 20 years, we've seen technological advances in many walks of life. I mean, society and the world around us has changed in so many ways over the last 20 to 30 years, especially because of the rise of the internet. However, one area that hasn't really seen much fundamental innovation is when it comes to money. I mean, we've seen old systems, ways of transacting, what used to be a lot or almost fully physical with cash has really digitized, of course, into now most of transactions being done digitally, whether that be via credit card, apps, you name it. So in that sense, there has been innovation when it comes to transacting and money, but the fundamental underlying innovation that is money really hasn't changed much. I mean, we still use a US dollar today as we did a US dollar 30 years ago, right? And one of the beauties of the internet is that it allows us to remove the middleman in a lot of cases. Let's take an example of YouTube, where you would used to have to go through production houses and be put onto cable television to reach an audience. YouTube fundamentally changed that, where now creators can directly publish to a website by themselves whenever they want. And so this removal of the middleman can be very important in a lot of ways, and especially when it comes to money. Because the way that money is currently set up in today's society is that money is oftentimes centrally issued, and also the rails in which we use to send money to other people is also done through a third-party intermediary. And now, before I want to get into the weeds of what Bitcoin is, I think it's important to discuss what problems does Bitcoin solve, right? Because every technology ultimately serves to solve a problem. Now, Bitcoin solves many problems, but when it comes to money, I think the two main issues that it solves is first the issuance of a currency and its supply being controlled by a centralized authority, and the ability to transact with each other without needing a third-party intermediary. Now let's dig into that a little bit and first discuss the topic of the issuance of the currency and its supply being controlled by a centralized authority. Now, to bring in an example from today's world, let's take a look at a common currency which is used all over the world, and that's the US dollar. And the US dollar is controlled by the Federal Reserve, which is a central bank of the United States. One of the main roles of the Fed is to control the supply and issuance of the US dollar. Now, before 1971, when President Richard Nixon removed us from the gold standard, the US and other countries around the world were required to hold gold in equivalent to the amount of currency in circulation. And currency holders could at any time trade in their dollars for gold. Now, this was important for many reasons, but two of the main reasons why this was important is that it provided price stability and protection from hyperinflation. Since the money supply was closely tied to gold reserves, significant inflation or deflation was generally limited as long as the gold supply remained relatively stable. Countries on what was called the gold standard were often shielded from hyperinflation because the money supply was not easily expanded without corresponding gold reserves. Now, another reason why having a currency being tied to a hard asset like gold is important is because it creates this hard money, and it also limits the amounts of government spending. Because the gold standard restricted central banks and governments' ability to print money recklessly, governments were also constrained in their ability to finance deficits without possessing adequate gold reserves, theoretically enforcing fiscal discipline. Now, I know that's a lot that I kind of just threw out there, but I think what's important is when it comes to the issuance of a currency or its supply, what we call in the Bitcoin world or in economics as well is it's important that the money be hard. And what that means is that the money is not easily created and has an element of scarcity to it. So in this case, when we lived on the gold standard and money was tied to gold, it really enforced this fiscal discipline onto governments because they couldn't just print money out of thin air and use that to, finance and pay for their programs or whatever. They were disciplined to be tied to these gold reserves because at any point, anybody could go in and theoretically redeem their money for gold. And so when Nixon ended the gold standard in 1971, it removed these constraints and allowed governments to issue money without it really being tied to anything, without it being tied to a hard asset like gold. And so to give perspective on the impact that this had, in 1971, the total M2 measure of money supply, which is how we, typically calculate the amount of money in circulation, was $600 billion. Okay. In 2023, that number is over $20 trillion. Now, this represents an increase of roughly 3,200%, meaning that compared to 1971, now there is roughly 3,200% more currency in circulation than there was then. And that's, just an astonishing fact to me. And why this is dangerous is because this great increase in the supply can lead to, a host of different issues, but mainly hyperinflation or inflation, meaning that the cost of living, because you have more currency in circulation, the cost of living goes up and people are unable to afford what was typically more affordable. And we're specifically seeing that now, I think, in 2023, as I'm recording this podcast. The cost of living has skyrocketed, and many of my peers and people I know, a lot of people have to live paycheck to paycheck, are unable to save money, and even have to maybe sometimes go into credit card debts or other types of debt just to live a normal life. And part of this comes down to the money not being tied to a hard asset and there not being any fiscal discipline enforced when it comes to government spending. So this is important to note because hyperinflation, it's a form of economic disaster that's only unique to government money. There was never an example in history of hyperinflation with economies that operated on a gold or a silver standard. And if we look again at history, we can see that all fiat, which means government decreed currencies, throughout history have always died, and you should not expect your country's currency to prove an exception to this rule. Whether that be the euro or the US dollar, they are all at risk of being inflated away. I won't get into the full examples of history, but I encourage everybody to just, if you have time and interest, study this and look back at history and see that a lot of these currencies that aren't tied to anything don't survive. And even in countries where we think it's not possible, I mean, we hear nowadays of inflation and hyperinflation in countries like Argentina. We've obviously heard of the classic Zimbabwe example, but it can happen anywhere. I mean, look back to the early 1900s with the Weimar Republic in Germany. Germany was a first world country that ended up in hyperinflation. And so it doesn't take far to look at the examples of history to see that when money is tied to the government and there's nothing backing it, it typically does not bode well for the citizens who are holding the money. And so that's the first problem that we're dealing with when it comes to money, right? Is the currency and issuance and supply of the currency. Now, the second problem is the ability to send and receive money. Nowadays, since cash has, pretty much largely disappeared and most people don't use it anymore, especially in most of the developed world, most of the transactions are done through a third-party intermediary, right? If you take the example of holding money on a bank, you have your money there, the bank custodies that money for you, and then you use some type of vehicle like a card, whether that be a credit card or a debit card, to spend that money at a local store. And of course, this has brought a lot of efficiency to the world, but the problem with having a third-party intermediary who oversees or executes these transactions is that there's always a risk there, right? And there's a few different risks. There's the risk of one of these institutions going broke and even losing your money. We've seen this with prominent financial institutions like banks. We have seen also censorship, where people end up being censored and not able to spend their money for a variety of reasons. And then we also have a lot of people who in the world are unbanked and don't even have access to a bank and can't utilize these rails to send and receive money. And so this is also an issue, and something that hasn't really been able to be solved is how do we first create a money that is hard and verifiably scarce? And then second, how do we allow this money to be sent peer-to-peer without a third-party intermediary? And this is the exact point where Bitcoin comes along. Now, we've talked about the internet being a fundamental innovation and being able to remove the middleman in a lot of cases. And so when it comes to money, this is something that people and very notable computer scientists had been able to try to figure out for some time, is how do we create a money that is out of the hands of the government and that can be transacted and exchanged peer-to-peer without a third-party intermediary. As I said, there was a lot of people who attempted to solve this problem, but none of the examples really stuck, and there was not much success in this realm. And then, on October 31st, 2008, an individual or group using the pseudonym Satoshi Nakamoto published a white paper titled Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system, onto a cryptography mailing list. The first words posted by Satoshi Nakamoto were very eloquent in their simplicity. As he said, "I've been working on a new electronic cash system that's fully peer-to-peer with no trusted third party." And in the white paper, Satoshi laid out a new decentralized system of digital currency that would eliminate the need for financial intermediaries like banks to facilitate transactions. He also stated that he found a way to create a decentralized network that could achieve consensus without any controlling authority. The main properties of Bitcoin, which he stated, were that double spending is prevented with a peer-to-peer network. There's no mint or trusted third parties. Participants can be anonymous, and new coins are made from Hashcash style proof of work. Now, initially when Satoshi posted this white paper, it was met by a lot of skepticism. There's this very famous figure in Bitcoin, and actually the first recipient of Bitcoin, Hal Finney, who's very, very well known in the space. And he said that when Satoshi announced Bitcoin on the cryptography mailing list, he got a skeptical reaction at best. Cryptographers have seen too many grand schemes by clueless noobs. They tend to have a knee-jerk reaction at best. And Satoshi's original post was not met with, again, much praise, or it was met with a lot of skepticism. And the reason why is because there was a problem that really hadn't been solved when it comes to digital cash. And this problem is called the Byzantine's general problem. And in short, the Byzantine's general problem refers to the challenge of achieving consensus and coordinated action among distributed participants or systems, even when some of these are unreliable or malicious. And this was a problem that, again, a lot of computer scientists had racked their brains on and weren't really able to connect the dots when it came to digital cash. And again, when Satoshi posted it, people were skeptical. They didn't at first receive Bitcoin very well because, he claimed to have done something which people had long attempted to do. And now Bitcoin solved the Byzantine's general problem through its proof of work consensus mechanism, where network participants, or miners, expend computational effort to validate and chronologically order transactions on a transparent and immutable public ledger, ensuring that even in the presence of malicious actors, only one version of transaction history is agreed upon by the majority. Now, I know that's a mouthful, and again, I don't expect you to understand everything that I'm saying in this episode. As the episodes go on, I will continue to dive deeper into each topic. But what's important to note from this is that Satoshi solved a long-standing problem in computer science, and that's the Byzantine's general problem. And so after posting this white paper and receiving some initial feedback and criticism from the original cyberpunks who, saw this post, the first Genesis block was mined on January 3rd, 2009. And to understand what the Genesis block is, imagine a bookkeeping ledger that adds new pages or blocks daily and contains a record of all the Bitcoin transactions ever made. The very first page of this book is called the Genesis block. And again, I'll explain this more in future episodes, but the Genesis block was the original Bitcoin block that was mined, and it was mined on January 3rd, 2009, roughly a bit more than 2 months after Satoshi posted his white paper on the cryptography mailing list. And the interesting thing about the Genesis block is that Satoshi incorporated this interesting quote into the Genesis block, which was a snippet from the Times, which is a newspaper, from the day of the Genesis block, so January 3rd, 2009, and the title of the Times was Chancellor on the Brink of Second Bailout for Banks. And Satoshi inscripted this onto the Bitcoin blockchain as the first block. And it's fascinating because that's an ode to the times that we were living in. And, 2009, we were in the height of the financial crisis and, where all these banks were being bailed out because of their reckless, policies and decisions that they made that ended up hurting a lot of the citizens who held money in their banks and broader speaking as well. And so this Genesis block inscription, I think, is fascinating and amazing because it really, sets the tone for what Bitcoin is going to do. Satoshi's saying, look, all these big banks who, through their own reckless, decisions and greed, cause a lot of people to lose money and causes financial crisis are being bailed out. Why don't we create a new financial system that is independent of this and sets the tone for a better financial future? And that's what the Genesis block did. It really provided for a new financial system away from the current mess of a system that we are in, and where there's no central authority or group of people determining the monetary policy and changing it at a whim, or people getting bailed out because of their reckless decisions. And so the Genesis block was mined on January 3rd, 2009. And then 6 days later, on January 9th, 2009, Satoshi Nakamoto published the source code of Bitcoin, version 0.001, on sourceforge.net. And Bitcoin was born. So to summarize what we talked about, in the first 20 minutes of this podcast, Bitcoin was created for a need, right? Like all technological innovations, they're all created because there's something that is either inefficient or wrong with the current system, and the technology seeks to innovate on that and provide a better future. And when it comes to Bitcoin, it's tackling arguably one of the biggest beasts in the world, which is money, and trying to create a new financial system and a new way of doing things. Where in the last 30 years or so, we've seen incredible government greed around the world through reckless printing of money. We've seen multiple inflationary and hyperinflationary events around the world. And we've also seen a lot more division and political, unrest around the world, I think, as a result of this. And Bitcoin, it's an invention that sparked out of a need, because there's a saying in Bitcoin that's, if you fix the money, you fix the world. Because at the root of it, money is how we function in society. It's how we convey value. It's how we exchange our hard-earned work for something else. Think about it, right? Most people work for a salary. You're working for an hourly or yearly wage or whatever it may be. And oftentimes the currency in which you are being rewarded for that work is, a US dollar or a euro or whatever it may be. But the fact that you're receiving something for your hard work that can be so easily printed and essentially manipulated by governments is absurd. You should be able to store your value in something that's hard, that retains its value over the years. And a lot of people, because money, typically if you just receive a paycheck, doesn't really hold value over the long term, people are forced to make investments. People are forced to make investments, whether it be real estate, whether it be stocks, whether it be whatever, because they know that if they keep their money on a bank over the long run, it will not hold its value. And that's a shame, because we shouldn't all have to be investors, right? People who are interested in investing should be able to invest, but you should also be able to store your money into something that's hard and that you can rest assured will keep its value over the long run. And so, again, that's what Bitcoin seeks to solve. It seeks to solve these problems of how can we have a money that's verifiably scarce out of the hands of, these centralized authorities that can just manipulate it and print it at will, and that I can send to anybody anywhere across the world without having to rely on a centralized party or third-party intermediary. And so Bitcoin provides a decentralized, trustless, and censorship-resistant method of transferring value over a digital medium without relying on intermediaries. And that's just a fundamental innovation of our times. And this episode, again, serves to just give you an introduction to what it is, what the problem is or what the problems are that Bitcoin solves. We'll delve more into the details of specific sections of Bitcoin and how it works in later episodes, but that's kind of the gist that I want you to get out of this episode, is how fundamental of an innovation Bitcoin truly is. And I know a big question that most of you are probably asking right now as well. It sounds great. This is amazing. Well, at least I hope that's what you think. But now the question is, who is Satoshi Nakamoto, right? Who is this mysterious, shadowy figure that just, dropped this invention onto the world and nobody knows who he is? And I think that's what's another thing that's so interesting about Bitcoin, right? Because it's a question that's been asked since the invention of Bitcoin. And to this day, nobody has been able to identify who Satoshi Nakamoto is. Now, there have been multiple attempts to identify him, of course, once Bitcoin became more popular and, started to receive some mainstream attention. People, of course, wanted to figure out who this person or group is. But to this day, nobody knows who Satoshi Nakamoto is, or at least nobody knows publicly who Satoshi Nakamoto is. And Satoshi's interactions were also limited to email exchanges and posts on the bitcointalk.org forum for a brief duration of just over 2 years. So, of course, when Bitcoin first came out, he was, of course, the shepherd of the technology and wanted to communicate it to the world and wanted to, tell everybody how it worked and the fundamental innovation that it was, and also worked with some early, developers to fine-tune it. And but this was limited to a brief period of about 2 years. And during this time, in his interactions, nobody was either able to identify who this person was or is. The last that we had heard or have heard of Satoshi Nakamoto was in 2011. So this is 12 years ago now. And what caused Satoshi to suddenly disappear is also a mystery, because just when Bitcoin appeared poised to take off and was beginning to attract serious attention, Satoshi Nakamoto retreated from the public eye. And there's speculation, of course, as to what caused him to disappear. You would think someone who invented this fundamental, innovation and technology would, especially when it is tied to money, would probably try to stick around. But Satoshi Nakamoto disappeared. And again, there's speculation as to what caused him to disappear, but there's one event that is speculated to have sped up Satoshi's departure. And that is when PayPal stopped processing transactions or payments for Wikileaks. And as a result of this, and again, this kind of ties back right to our topic earlier about, when the transferring of money is controlled by a third-party intermediary, they can dictate at any point what you can and cannot do with your money. And this was an example in Wikileaks where PayPal said, no, we will no longer process payments for Wikileaks. And then an article was published in PC Magazine, which actually stated that WikiLeaks could benefit from Bitcoin because Bitcoin, didn't have this issue. There was nobody saying who can and cannot, send money using Bitcoin. And Satoshi, then made a post after this article was published that seemed to indicate that he wasn't really comfortable with Bitcoin getting this kind of attention and was not really ready for such a relationship yet. In fact, what he stated was, WikiLeaks has kicked the hornet's nest and the swarm is headed towards us. So I think with this WikiLeaks, and obviously it was a pretty hot button issue at the time, and when Bitcoin was stated as a solution, I mean, obviously that's what inevitably, you would want, right? You would want your innovation to be acknowledged for the purpose it was created. But Satoshi was uncomfortable with this because, or at least in the beginning, because maybe he didn't feel Bitcoin was ready for it. He was worried that, okay, wow, I've released this invention and now the public eye is headed for me. And so who knows what ended up, resulting in Satoshi's departure. But significantly, this post was written just 19 hours before his last post on the forum, which was the release of Bitcoin version 0.3.19. Now, at this time, there was also a lot of core developers who were working on Bitcoin and who were working on developing it. And so it wasn't just Satoshi who was, quote unquote, in charge of the protocol. And of course, Bitcoin's an open source protocol, so there's not, one person that's in charge. But allegedly, a lead core developer by the name of Gavin Andresen is the last person to have had a private exchange with Satoshi. And in this email, which Gavin has since made public, Satoshi said that, and this is a quote, "I wish you wouldn't keep talking me as a mysterious, shadowy figure. The press just turns it into a pirate currency angle. Maybe instead make it about the open source project and give more credit to your dev contributors. It helps motivate them." And I think there's such beauty in that. And that's one of the things that's so beautiful about Bitcoin is because it's an open source protocol. Everybody can see the code, and it's a protocol of rules, not rulers, meaning that there's rules that define the Bitcoin protocol, but there's no rulers, meaning that there's not one person who controls the Bitcoin protocol, not even Satoshi, and Satoshi also, in saying that, is that he didn't want it to be about him. He wanted to bring this invention to the world because it was important and because it was necessary. But we see in him retreating from the public eye and saying statements like he did in that last email to Gavin Andresen that Satoshi didn't want it to be about him. He didn't want it to be, become the founder of Bitcoin and have all this acclaim and anything like that. He purposely retreated from the public eye and also had an emphasis on making it about others and not him. And I think that's really beautiful, honestly. I think it's almost poetic in a way because that's what Bitcoin's about, right? It's not about one person. It's about a collective and having rules that incentivize people to work together and work in each other's best interests. And that was the last, that email exchange was the last that Satoshi was heard of. It's still a mystery to this day who Satoshi is, where they are they alive, are they a group, what's going on, right? Nobody knows the identity of Satoshi Nakamoto. It's almost like a divine conception where we don't know who it is, and there's beauty behind that, and I think it's almost, when I think about it, it can almost be like a movie, right, where we have this shadowy coder who comes out of the realm and releases this invention onto the world, and then right when his invention is poised to take off, disappears from the public eye. And at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter who Satoshi Nakamoto is. If we were to identify who he or she or they are tomorrow, I mean, obviously it would create a news, and it would be, a pretty fundamental discovery of Bitcoin, but it wouldn't have an impact on the Bitcoin protocol because Bitcoin operates on a decentralized consensus mechanism, meaning that changes to the protocol require broad agreements among network participants, and no single individual, including Satoshi Nakamoto, has the authority to unilaterally dictate or alter its rules. And so that's Satoshi Nakamoto. We don't know who he, she, or they are. They disappeared from the public eye in 2011. And another thing that's important to note is none of Satoshi's coins, because obviously in the beginning he mined a lot of the first Bitcoins, none of them have moved. And that's also so unique, I think, because especially Bitcoin's value has increased monumentally since the founding of Bitcoin. And so Satoshi's value is I think, if he, at the height of the Bitcoin bull market, was one of, if not the richest person in the world. And so just that incentive, the fact that, they never moved their coins, is also a very unique fact, in my opinion, that speaks to, I think, the identity of Satoshi Nakamoto and who they are, and so yeah, it's a mystery, but I think it's nice that it is a mystery. I think it adds an element of, like I said, almost this like divine conception, where it's just this like invention that was fundamental and beautiful to the world and was almost a gift to us. And I think that's why, Satoshi's identity not being known, I think is beautiful. And to summarize kind of what we talked about, I want to use a quote from a book called The Bitcoin Standard, which is an incredible book for anybody interested in learning more about, monetary history and why Bitcoin is so important. But in it, there's a quote that says, if the modern world is ancient Rome, suffering the consequences of monetary collapse, with the dollar our aureus, then Satoshi Nakamoto is our Constantine. Bitcoin his Solidas, and the internet is our Constantinople. And yeah, it's just, I know I said it a lot, but I think Bitcoin is really just such a fundamental innovation. And I hope in this episode that I've been able to kind of lay out, or at least give you a better understanding of what it is and why it's important. And there's probably a lot that's still very difficult to grasp. And that's the aim of this podcast, right? Is for me to be able to explain Bitcoin in a way that's easy to understand and digest. And in future episodes, we'll be looking more into the different areas of Bitcoin. And, the more that you listen to this podcast, I think the better understanding that you'll have. Bitcoin, it's a concept that's pretty difficult in the beginning to grasp and to understand, and it took me a while to really understand its impact. So don't be too hard on yourself if some of what I've been saying, or most, or whatever in this episode hasn't been the easiest to understand. But I think it's also worth maybe re-listening to this episode and thinking about that as well. But yeah, I think in this episode, what I really wanted to do is say what Bitcoin is in the way of what does it solve, and that's the issues of the current currencies around the world being centrally issued and the supply being dictated by governments with no ties to hard assets like gold or anything like that. And then also the transferring of value between people, which is also largely controlled by third-party intermediaries. And paving a way for a new system where we have a form of money that is verifiably scarce, digital, and able to be sent peer-to-peer without any trusted third parties or intermediaries. Hope it all made a bit sense. And yeah, again, I will be in future episodes breaking down everything into more detail. But with that, I really want to thank you so much for taking the time to listen. I hope you enjoyed this podcast, and until next time.